The western sea presses itself against a mountain of stone, and in the cold hours before dawn the waves speak in a voice that never tires. They comb the long beaches and fling the moon in shards across wet sand. They rumble against steep, ancient cliffs riddled with tunnels and chambers where the air tastes of metal and salt. Above that patient ocean sits a fortress older than memory, cut from the same colossal rock that bears its name. A lion asleep with eyes half open, listening, never forgetting. In the halls of that stronghold, torchlight trembles as if in deference to the stone. The light knows how briefly it lives. The rock knows how long it endures. In that place, where gold is pulled out of the mountain like honey from a comb, a boy learned the grammar of power the way other children learn their prayers. Through repetition, observation, and the knowledge that errors invite punishment by forces that do not explain themselves. The boy's name was Tywin of House Lannister, and in childhood he walked through galleries of tapestries that dazzled even closed eyes. He saw lions threaded in silk, plucking deer to the ground with velvet paws that hid claws of winter. He watched the retainers of his house come and go, saw their eyes slide from his father's face to the floor and back again, wary and quick, as if his father were a startled falcon perched at the edge of flight rather than a lord seated on a throne of red-veined marble. The boy heard laughter at times when laughter felt like a draft through a cracked window in winter. Cold, small, and out of place. When men should have fallen silent, they smiled instead. When debts should have been recited in hard voices, they were lamented like the lines of a song. The great house of the West, whose gold could buy many kings and feed 1,000 winters, was adrift. The ledgers swelled like bellies, and the banners hung with a tired tilt. Tywin learned that a coat of arms weighs little if not carried by a spine that will not bend. He made a quiet oath then, an oath that required no words, to exchange soft laughter for hard order, to fold back the excess of sentiment as a seam is folded neat and straight, leaving no loose threads. He grew in rooms where the scent of wax and parchment mingled with the smell of water that climbed out of the rock's deep lungs. He learned to hold a quill with a soldier's grip, to see that a number is a soldier too, marching in neat rows, conquering when properly arranged. If he wished to sleep, the sea would not let him. It murmured the accounting of waves, one after another, inventory without end. He learned that beauty could be disciplined, that even the lamplight could be coaxed into a steady, unblinking gaze. When messengers arrived, breath misting at their mouths in winter, he listened for what was not said. A pause here, a quiver there. He asked himself, what does a realm do when it sees that its lord is a gentle man, and that his gentleness invites wolves to the door? The boy answered himself by growing into a man whose smile could not be purchased and whose silence would be a sharper instrument than other men's swords. When the lion stirs, the lesser beasts remember their places. The man who had been a boy took a measure of his father's debts, and then he took a measure of the West. He read the hills the way others read faces and saw where every stream of loyalty ran dry and where it pooled. He rode out with banners that did not flare in the wind so much as they hung like judgments. He took the small lords by the hand and led them away from the habit of thinking themselves indispensable. To those who confused kindness with weakness, he spoke in the grammar of consequence. There were names that had ripened on the vine beyond their season, houses in revolt not from hunger but from the pleasure of defiance. To them he sent an answer in iron and in fire and in silence afterward, so complete the air itself seemed to walk barefoot. In the minds of an ancestral foe, he found tunnels like veins and sealed them with stone, giving back to the earth what it had once surrendered. Not gold this time, but the last warm breath of those who believed the lion had forgotten how to bite. The song that followed, learned by heart across taverns and keeps, remembered rain falling where none were left to hear it. Sometimes a tune does what a decree cannot, and the realm came to understand that the West had put away its indulgences. Laughter ceased to float where it did not belong. When debts were named, they were paid. When oaths were sworn, they bound. He learned to sit very still. It is a discipline one gains by standing not behind the throne but beside it, hands folded, eyes open, hearing not the words but the machine beneath them. He returned order to his house and then carried that same cool order beyond the sea-salted cliff. When a king who had been born to ease and danger invited him close, Tywin stood at his shoulder and made a kingdom walk as straight as the lines on a ledger. He moved revenues like regiments and deployed both with the same elegant minimalism. Petitions ceased to ferment. Roads were mended, laws were sharpened, and those who fattened themselves on confusion found the meat suddenly scarce. The realm thought it recognized simplicity, but what it recognized was not simple. It was a refusal to blink. He became the sharper edge of another man's crown. The king prospered and grew suspicious, as kings do when they discover the comforts of competence are accompanied by the discomfort of comparison. Tywin learned then that service without vanity looks like a mirror to those who would prefer fog. In chambers where the walls drank sound and kept it for themselves, he held his counsel, and when his counsel was not taken, he made a note of the price. A ruler who toys with those who keep him upright toys with the height of his own fall. The marriage his daughter had been promised was withdrawn. The heir he had Ashend was co-opted into a brotherhood that promised honor at the price of posterity. The lion does not weep when the hunt goes awry. He measures the field again. Tywin led his family through the narrow corridors of disappointment and back into halls that smelled of wax and iron and the sea. He married his daughter elsewhere, bound her to law where love fails, and placed his sons where they could do the work that matters. Not the making of speeches, but the steady administration of consequence. If there is a defining cold, it is not winter. It is the knowledge that the world will only be as orderly as the will that arranges it. He kept the will in a quiet place behind his eyes. He did not shout. He did not need to. When rebellions rose in far fields, when banners unfamiliar to the west snapped over riverlands and mountains and marshes, he listened to the hoofbeats of distance and counted them. A kingdom is not a story. It is a fabric. It tears most easily at the seams already frayed by neglect. He sent armies not simply to destroy, but to make a shape of the realm again. A shape that would hold when men were hungry for legend and hungry for bread. He stood in command tents that breathed canvas and horse sweat and marked the movement of companies as if aligning entries in a balance sheet. He understood that every victory requires a sacrifice and that better to spend iron than bleeding coin on endless border fires. To his enemies he sent what mercy requires: speed. To his allies he offered the comfort that comes when rules are rules, even if one does not like them. He believed to the bone that chaos is slower death, and he hated waste more than he hated any single man. There were disappointments, inevitable and particular. A son with quick hands and quicker wit who cracked jokes as if words were shields. A son of shining promise whose oath to a white-cloaked brotherhood cut the bloodline with a beautiful, infuriating stroke. A daughter with a hunter's eye who mistook the snare for the forest. A father does not choose his children any more than a lord chooses the weather, but he can build walls that keep the worst of it out. So he raised his house like a seawall. Behind it, a city of numbers and ironwork ticked. Behind it, stewards learned to file and captains learned to stand. He taught his household that sentiment is a private luxury, not a public policy. And still, in small hours, memory would arrive like the sea's breath and chill the skin. And he would recall a woman's calm intelligence and the child whose birth took her away. The night gives back what the day takes, not out of kindness, but because it has room. War came in its larger form, the kind that remakes maps and opens graves. Banners swarmed the roads, and the air over fields grew busy with ravens. Tywin chose ground with a cautious man's inevitability, denied the enemy what the enemy most needed, offered them what they could not refuse and should not accept. He sent decoys to taste the enemy's teeth and tightened his grip where it mattered. When the north moved like winter through river valleys, he countered with timing, always timing, the surest horse in any stable. He understood that defeat blooms in haste. He understood that victory rides the horse that eats last and sleeps last and does not stumble because the hand on the rein does not tremble. He moved a city to reinforce a throne, not out of love for the head that wore the crown, but because a throne must be heavier than the men who sit on it. The sea of steel that opened along the river near the capital curdled and broke when he arrived with allies whose flowers smelled of summer and promise. The city was saved, and the boy king lifted his chin as if he had lifted the blade himself. Tywin bowed without bending. Power is able to speak very softly because it is not afraid to repeat itself. He repeated himself by arranging marriages that sealed cracks and forgings that made old swords new. He sat beneath a tapestry where a lion lay among vines not because he believed the image, but because he knew symbols do not have to be true. They only have to be recognized. Quietly, he removed men who confused conscience with hesitation and promoted others who understood that peace is a set of decisions that seldom looks like kindness when made. He asked lords to pay the debt of their gratitude with compliance. He asked small folk nothing. Their reward was the dullness that descends when things function. He believed in dullness the way sailors believe in sound ships. Far from the capital, in halls richer with wood smoke than with perfume, there was a wedding arranged as one arranges a calculation. Step by step, ensuring the sum cannot surprise. Hospitality, that old law older even than kings, was bent to the stern necessity he recognized in his bones. A man with a crown of wolves walked into a hall to dine and never walked out again. The river changed its song, and generations would speak of that night both in whispers and in public fury that could not alter what had been done. Tywin marked the ledger of the war with a line as clean as a blade that has met the whetstone. He did not seek to be adored in the songs. He sought to end an arithmetic of blood that would otherwise run on and on. Behind his eyes, sleep came as it always did, with a measured pace, and if the faces of the fallen knocked at his door at odd hours, he would open to no one and rise in the morning convinced of the same thing he was convinced of the night before. That order, once restored, must be fed. His enemies called him cruel, and some of his allies did too in safer rooms. There is a cruelty that delights. His did not. There is a cruelty that calculates and then looks away. He looked straight at what he had done and did not blink. Where he could, he offered prisoners a swift ending. Where he had to, he offered examples. There is a difference between vengeance and warning, and he practiced the latter in a way that made the world mistake it for the former. When a quiet girl poured his wine in a captured castle, he decided that a child who knew how not to tremble might as well be useful, and he asked questions. He was not cruel to her because he saw value in calm, because he never wasted a good instrument, because some hard men, even the hardest, remember the mothers who once told them stories to keep the night from growing teeth. In the capital, he reigned without the title reserved for the one who sat on the iron chair. He walked through echoing chambers where the light pooled on dark floors, and he left the small details to the men whose minds lived in small things. He wrote letters in a hand as neat as a drawn sword and sent them like arrows to the corners of the realm. He practiced the art that no poet finds room for in his verse, the administrative patience that makes a continent work. Grain arrived where it needed to. Ships were compelled to pay. Coin did what drumbeats cannot. He was a servant to outcomes, a man who could hold the world steady for as long as his breath held steady too. Yet the house he had built with such attention to line and seam contained fractures that no mason can reach. His daughter believed that the fortress of family can be confused with the fortress of self. His golden son, for all his brilliance with blade and horse, wore vows that forbade him from fulfilling the single duty a father asks of a firstborn. And the small son, the one who moved like quicksilver through conversations and smoke, carried in him a wit that embarrassed fools and a loneliness that embarrassed pity. Tywin tried, in the way a cartwright tries to fix a cracked wheel without replacing the wood, to correct what could not be corrected with the tools at hand. He married the small one to a girl whose copper hair might yield a future that books and bloodlines would accept. He tightened the reins on the daughter until her wrists chafed. He watched the golden sun with a soldier's pride that was no closet for private affection. He offered not tenderness but tasks, not praise but expectation. Few men had ever understood better that a realm is held together by what men do, not what they feel. He applied that truth too diligently at home. The crown he kept polished wobbled and struck itself against fate at a feast meant to celebrate the permanence of power. A boy king's face turned a terrible color. The music stuttered. Courtiers froze in place like carved figures who had lost their hands. The city's air went tight for a long, long heartbeat, then broke into panic that tasted of perfume and spilt wine. Grief, fear, accusation. These are the tools of lesser men when threatened. Tywin reached for the one instrument he trusted: process. There would be a trial. The realm loves a theater that ends in a verdict. His small son sat beneath hard eyes and smiled his broken smile, and then did not smile at all. There are moments in a life that later stain everything they touch. That trial was such a moment. It was not justice he pursued, but stability dressed as justice, because stability must always wear something to be let out in company. He believed the ends demanded that costume. His children thought he believed only in the costume. That night, when the air was thick with lanterns, he walked the corridors of his house within a palace and felt the weariness that comes when victory begins to taste like dust. He was not a man of the bedchamber. He had long ago traded tenderness for the discipline of emptiness, and even where his pleasures were concerned, he preferred quiet and privacy to the clowning of lust. But loneliness will seek its own masquerade, and he allowed it a face that, when torn away, revealed the longest concealed ugliness of his family's tragedy. That disdain can be as corrosive as hatred, and that the line between use and betrayal is thin enough to cut the skin when walked upon in the dark. A door opened, a hand shook. The past, cleverly concealed across many years and many policies, put out its foot and tripped him. Men say that death has a smell like copper and extinguished candles. For him, death had the smell of polished wood and the soft damp of a room built for relief, not for ceremony. A crossbow string is a homely thing, no more glamorous than a bootlace when seen up close, and twice as honest. It speaks in one syllable. It requires only that the hand holding it has moved past argument. He faced his killer with the composure he had practiced all his life. The words he used to defend his dignity were the last tools he would ever wield. He discovered in that final instant that even a man who has rarely been surprised can still be surprised by the fact of the end, by how small a room must be to hold it, and by how large a silence feels when it arrives with no successor. The sea, which had always murmured beneath his life, did not pause. The city outside did not stop its trade. The realm he had held straight did not immediately slouch. Death is without ceremony for most of us. In that, at least, he was not exceptional. What, then, remains of a man like this when the body cools? The castle he once patrolled with a glance still sits like a mountain beside a patient sea. The gold still comes out of the rock the way sunlight comes through a window that has been cleaned by diligent hands. In the villages along the western roads, old men still point to milestones he ordered placed or repaired. In the capital, records bear his hand, neat and unmistakable, rows and columns that permitted a nation to feed itself while songs and slanders forgot their words and had to be taught them again. He stamped his will across the temper of an age and called it prudence. If mercy was seldom his first instinct, it was not unknown to him. It simply stood in line behind clarity, order, and consequence. The men who hated him will say the realm paid too much. The men who admired him will say the realm paid only WH. At such an outcome costs. Within the family whose banner he kept high and clean, his absence unmasked the truth that had always been hovering in doorways and quietly attending dinners. That he had been the mortar, and that without mortar even stones that shine will slide. His daughter learned there are victories that exhaust the very ground they conquer. His golden son learned that a vow spotless before gods can still be stained before men. His small son, walking eastward in exile, carried a memory like a thorn, and sometimes a thorn keeps a man awake who might otherwise sleep away his wits. There was a time in his youth when he watched water move along the rock's edge, wearing at it with a patience that had no rival, and he thought to himself that the sea and the lion are kin. The lion is sudden, the sea is relentless. The lion takes, the sea returns, but both are inevitable in their fashion and both are old. He built his life to resemble the sea's slow certainty as much as the lion's flare of muscle. He ate early and wrote late. He tolerated fools only as long as fools could be made to serve a plan. If he loved at all after youth, he loved in the manner of a craftsman for whom perfection is a substitute for gentleness. That is, he loved by making things strong. The songs about him will vary in key. In some, he will stride through the verses like a cliff through mist. In others, the melody will keep circling the same few notes. The sealed tunnels in a rebellious keep, the wedding that turned to knives, The city saved because he came over the bridge at the precise moment when time paired with courage and made a lever. A few songs, sung rarely, and then only when the singers are sure no one will report them, will tell of a night that stank of fear and furniture, of a shattered intimacy for which there is no elegant name. He would not have cared for any of the songs. He would have corrected their dates and their numbers and suggested that the singers learn the difference between cause and coincidence. He would have walked past them toward the ledger that waits eternally for a dutiful hand. He knew the faces of his banners by heart, the gilded thread of the lion's mane, the way the cloth took the sun. He knew the faces of his enemies too, less by feature than by habit. There is always a man who believes a sudden, splendid deed will overturn a world. There is always another who thinks time is on his side because he desires it to be. He stood against both kinds, wielding patience like a sledge. He once told a subordinate that the realm is not a creature that can be impressed into tameness. It is a multiplicity that must be coordinated. He did not say this to be quoted. He said it because he had counted the cost of every cheerful promise and found the total always short. He longed not for love, a weather he considered treacherous, but for durability. Sometimes in winter, the rock remembers every footfall and gives them back as hollow knocks that travel the corridors at strange hours. A guard hears what he will insist must be the gate of a great lord long gone, and a kitchen girl says she felt a draft, and a steward finds a candle guttered for no reason and marks the tallow like an omen. But ghosts are as practical as the living, insensible castles. If he walks at all, he does not walk to frighten or to mourn. He would walk, if walking were given to him after, to check locks, to inspect hinges, to weigh stores with his eye. He would walk to the windows that overlook the sea and consider the moisture's effect on the stone. He would nod at a well-ordered room as a man nods at another who wears his cloak with proper fit. What does a man take with him when he goes where no office waits? He takes the sum of his choices, not as a judge's verdict, but as a craftsperson's tools grown transparent by use. He takes the sound of the sea, the only thing older than the rock and as constant as his waking mind. He takes the scent of parchment and wax, of clean steel, of good leather warmed by the wear of a day. He takes the vision of roads laid straight across a land that too often preferred the poetry of wandering. He takes the knowledge that for a span of years measured not in eras, not in generations, but in the stubborn currency of days, he steadied the realm. He takes, too, the regrets that come even to men who deny regret a chair at the table. A wife buried before her time, a son he did not know how to hold, another he trusted to be perfect, a daughter he treated as a treaty. These are the coins even the richest cannot spend away. And still, along the western shore, the waves go about their uninterrupted duties. The air above them cools at dusk and gathers the scent of kelp and the tang of rock. Fishermen tell each other weather as if they were discussing genealogy, and children kick at pebbles that once lay miles down a tunnel where men chipped them free in the name of wealth. High above, the fortress drinks the light the way old stone does. Slowly, without fuss, a gratitude so restrained it might be mistaken for indifference. Within those halls, whitewash cracks along an angle too fine for eyes tired by late dinners. Somewhere a clerk oils a hinge, and somewhere a captain checks the wear on a bridle. In the counting rooms, dust lies quiet but not idle. It records what it touches. If the lion on the banners could sleep, he would sleep as the sea does, by moving always. There are days when one can stand on the outer ramparts and feel 2 times at once. The present breathes at your back. The past approaches from the sea, its breath enormous and regular, bringing stories with it the way a tide brings shells. People ask their questions, small or grand, and they walk away with answers that satisfy for an evening. They do not understand that the rock has its own questions, asked without words. Will the next steward keep the books as straight? Will the roads hold? Will the children who come after remember? Are that prosperity is not a harvest but a discipline? A name earned in one lifetime can be squandered in the next, and the stone, which has seen more than names, murmurs its skepticism in tiny flakes that drift unnoticed to the floor. It is easy, in the glow of hearths and the comfort of evenings, to think of power as spectacle. He knew better. He knew it as a habit, a refusal to exaggerate and a refusal to minimize, a taste for seeing what is before deciding what ought to be. He could have been smaller. He could have been gentler. He chose instead to be exact. Exact men inspire gratitude when trouble nears and resentment when it passes. The gratitude fades as quickly as mist off a field at noon. The resentment lasts longer. He counted this as cost of doing right by the task, not by his own applause. He thought of himself as necessary, and in his age he was right. When night settles completely along the western edge of the world, the ocean's voice deepens and the cliff takes it in. The windows of the rock shine like measured constellations. Somewhere, a scribe closes a ledger with a soft thud that sounds like modest finality. Somewhere, a sentry shifts and adjusts his cloak and straightens to the posture that befits a post that has been ennobled by centuries of attention. The bedchambers breathe quietly. Far below the castle, a thin strand of surf pulls and returns, the oldest conversation still underway. If one were to sit in an antechamber that once belonged to a man who believed that work, and work alone, might be a form of love, and listen, truly listen, one would hear in the hush not only the sea and the stone and the recital of the house's duties, but also a silence of a different sort. The silence that comes from tasks concluded, from a ledger closed, from a life spent with a purpose that does not beg for affection. That silence is not empty. It is the sleep of a lion who has chosen his ground. So let the story fold itself around you as the night does, patient and certain. Let the sea whisper its inventories, and let the rock stand where it has always stood. Consider a boy who looked at laughter and saw in it a warning rather than a comfort. Consider the man who kept his realm from shattering by refusing to be the daydream other men begged him to be. He was harsh because he believed the world is harsher and must be met with a hand that does not tremble. He was feared because fear once learned how to walk in step with respect. He was mourned by few who dared show it and by many who could not admit it. And somewhere, in the long corridors of memory that every house keeps whether it wants to or not, there is the echo of his measured tread, a sound like a verdict approaching, like a promise kept, like the sea taking one more step toward the stone, and then another, forever.